Today we're diving into the life of a true legend, James Dean. And it's fascinating, isn't it? How can someone who starred in just 3 major films leave such an indelible mark on, well, everything? Cinema, fashion, youth culture.
It really is a remarkable story, and for this deep dive, we're trying to explore, the core elements of his persona, the circumstances that kind of converge to create this lasting legend.
Right.
We've gone through a lot of comprehensive sources, biographies, analyses, historical records, to really try and unpack the facts and maybe some surprising details too.
So our goal today is to get behind that rebel icon image, look beyond it, and understand what really made him tick, what his life was like, and I guess why his legacy is still so powerful today.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really get James Dean, we have to start at the beginning. He was born James Byron Dean, February 8th, 1931, in Marion, Indiana. But the family moved to Santa Monica, California later, and that's where he started school.
And a really significant person in his early life was his mother, Mildred Marie Wilson.
Right.
Sources always talk about this incredibly close bond they had. She was seen as the only person capable of understanding him.
Oh.
Which makes it even more tragic that she got sick very suddenly, lost a lot of weight, and then died of uterine cancer. Dean was just 9.
9 years old. That's just devastating. And his father apparently couldn't care for him.
Yeah, that seems to be the story. So Dean was sent back to Indiana, this time to Fairmount, to live with his aunt and uncle, Hortense and Marcus Winslow, on their Quaker farm.
That's a huge shift. From Santa Monica to a rural Quaker farm, how did that shape him?
It must have been profound. A completely different environment, different values perhaps. And during his time there, he formed a connection with a local Methodist pastor, Reverend James DeWeerd.
Ah, okay.
And DeWeerd seems to have had a really formative influence, kind of shaping Dean's later interests in things like bullfighting, car racing, even theater. But it's also controversial. There are suggestions, mentioned in biographies, and apparently something Dean himself told Elizabeth Taylor, of an intimate or even sexual relationship between them, which really makes you think about those early experiences and their impact.
Despite all that turmoil, though, he did well in school.
Oh, exceptionally well, apparently.
Yeah.
He was popular, played sports baseball, varsity basketball, and was involved in drama, public speaking. Clearly talented.
A real all-rounder, then.
Seems like it. After high school, he headed back to California. Started at Santa Monica College, thinking pre-law initially.
Pre-law. Wow, okay.
Yeah, but the pull towards acting was strong. He transferred to UCLA and, crucially, changed his major to drama.
And what about his father at this point?
Apparently, the relationship remained difficult, described as uncommunicative antagonism. It seems that ultimately pushed Dean to drop out of UCLA in January *51 and just go for acting full-time.
So the leap into acting begins. His first gig was a Pepsi commercial in 1950.
Yeah, pretty humble beginnings for an icon, right?
Yep.
His first speaking part was playing John the Apostle in an Easter TV special, film #1. But success didn't come instantly. He really struggled for a bit.
Taking small roles.
Walk-on parts, yeah. Movies like Fixed Bayonets, Sailor Beware. He even worked as a parking lot attendant at CBS Studios to make ends meet. Shows you the drive he had.
So he's working the parking lot, and then comes a key connection, Rogers Brackett.
Right. Brackett was a radio director. He offered Dean guidance, a place to stay, basically a lifeline.
Okay.
And that connection was absolutely pivotal. It helped Dean land his first starring role on Broadway in See the Jaguar. That was the real shift, from extra to stage actor.
And that led him to New York City in '51.
Exactly. He moved to New York, had a brief funny stint as a stunt tester for a game show, apparently got fired for being too fast.
Huh. Too efficient.
Yeah, sort of sums him up, does it? But more importantly, he got into the actor's studio, studying method acting under Lee Strasberg.
That's huge. With Brando, Julie Harris?
The absolute pinnacle at the time. And method acting, the immersive style, really digging deep emotionally. It became central to his performances. He was apparently very proud to be one of the youngest members there.
And he kept doing TV work alongside them.
Yeah, building his resume. There was a notable role in a CBS series called Omnibus, an episode called Glory in the Flower in '53.
Okay.
And in that, he played the kind of alienated youth that would become his signature. And get this, it was one of the first dramatic TV shows to actually feature rock and roll music.
Really? That early? Interesting.
Yeah. But the big theatrical breakthrough came in 1954. He played Bachir in The Immoralist. based on Andre Gide's book.
And that got Hollywood's attention.
Absolutely. The reviews were great. The calls started coming. He also had an affair with his co-star, Geraldine Page, during that run. Her daughter later called him his artistic soulmate.
So things escalated fast from there.
Incredibly fast. It just set the stage for everything that followed.
This rapid rise, it wasn't just building a career, it was forging an icon. And that icon got cemented by just 3 films, starting with East of Eden in 1955.
Right. For East of Eden, the director, Elia Kazan, was specifically looking for a Brando type.
Okay.
Someone who could handle the complexity of Cal Trask. And it's funny, John Steinbeck, who wrote the book, apparently didn't like Dean personally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he still thought Dean was perfect for Cal. And Cal's a deeply troubled character, right? Seeking his father's approval, finding out his mother, who he thought was dead, is running a brothel. It's heavy stuff.
And Dean brought something unique to it, didn't he? The improvisation.
Oh, definitely. Things like that little dance in the bean field, or curling up almost like a fetus on top of the train car.
And that moment with his father.
Yeah, where the gift gets rejected and he just lunges forward and hugs him. Apparently that wasn't scripted. Kazan kept those moments in, and they're incredibly powerful. Raw.
And East of Eden was the only one released while he was alive.
That's right. And it earned him his first Oscar nomination for Best Actor, posthumously, in 1956. That was actually a first no actor had received a posthumous nomination before him.
Wow, history made right there. Then came Rebel Without a Cause, same year, 1955, and that one just exploded with teenagers.
Hugely popular. It's still seen as this quintessential portrayal of teenage angst, that feeling of being misunderstood.
Did he worry about being typecast as the rebel after that in East of Eden?
That's a great question. It seems he did. He apparently wanted to show more range, which led him to the role of Jet Rink in Giant.
Which came out after his death in 56.
Right, and for that role, he really changed his appearance. Dyed his hair gray, shaved some off to look older, showing he could do more than just the brooding teenager.
And Giant has that famous Last Supper scene.
Ah, yeah, where his character gives that drunken speech. Apparently, Dean mumbled so much it was unusable.
Oh, wow.
Nick Adams had to overdub the lines because Dean died before they finished editing. Another layer of tragedy to it all.
So Giant was his last film.
It was. And it earned him his second posthumous Best Actor nomination in 1957. Again, unprecedented. The only actor with 2 posthumous nominations.
Incredible. And makes you wonder what other roles he might have taken, like Rocky Graziano.
Exactly. So many what ifs.
So, beyond the screen, his private life seems just as complex, maybe even more so. Let's try and untangle some of that. Who are the key people early on?
Well, one really close friend, roommate at UCLA and in New York, was William Bast. He later wrote the first biography.
Right.
And much later, in 2006, Bast confirmed they'd had a sexual relationship. He even described Dean as being Rogers Brackett's kept boy.
Okay, so that adds another layer to the Brackett connection. What about relationships with women?
There were definitely relationships reported. Beverly Wills, Jeanette Lewis back in his UCLA days. In New York, actress Liz Sheridan described their time together in 1952 as a magical first love. And then there was Barbara Glenn they dated for about 2 years. Her letters to him actually sold for like $36,000 at auction later on.
Wow. Gives you a sense of the fascination. But the studio played a role in his image too, right? Warner Bros.
Oh, absolutely. They were actively crafting his public persona, putting out stories about his dates, grouping him with other heartthrobs like Rock Hudson and Tab Hunter as these eligible bachelors.
Standard Hollywood practice then, I suppose? How did that affect his most famous relationship with Pier Angeli?
That's the one people remember most. She was an Italian actress. They met on the Warner lot, exchanged jewelry. Angeli later called it a Romeo and Juliet kind of love. Said Dean was beautiful, especially his soul.
Sounds intense.
Very. But there were obstacles. Her mother apparently disapproved. Dean wasn't Catholic, dressed casually.
The rebel image wasn't mother approved?
Apparently not. And Warner Bros. Wasn't keen on him getting married either. Plus, some reports suggest Dean himself was hesitant, even though they found a marriage pamphlet with Pier penciled on it among his things after he died.
So, genuine love or something else?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You get conflicting accounts. Richard Davalos, who was in East of Eden, insisted Dean did want to marry her.
Okay.
But others, like Bast, Kazan, they hinted it might have been partly for publicity or that Dean's relationships with women were just, complicated.
All that speculation, it must have been intense.
Absolutely. And then while Dean was away, Angeli suddenly got engaged to singer Vic Damone.
Ouch. How did Dean react?
Reports say he was pretty irritated. There was even gossip he watched the wedding from his motorcycle across the street, though he denied doing anything that dumb.
A dramatic image, true or not.
Yeah. Angeli later said Dean was the love of her life. And her own story ended tragically, too. She died at 39 from a barbiturate overdose.
God, it's all so intense. Did he date others after Angeli?
Briefly, yeah.
Yeah.
Ursula Andress, the Swiss actress, she was actually with him the day he bought the Porsche he died in.
Another haunting detail. It seems like the public image and the private person were quite different. Leonard Rosenman said fans admired things Dean himself disliked.
Yeah, Rosenman, the composer, suggested Dean actually craved peace and intellectual growth. And the whole rebel thing was more of a compulsion, something he even sought therapy for later.
Interesting. So maybe not embracing the rebellion.
Or maybe it was more complex. Natalie Wood, his co-star in Rebel, thought his behavior wasn't just rebellion for its own sake. She felt it came from a deep need for connection, wanting people to just listen. She described him as moody and poetic, but not freaked out or drugged out, just needing understanding.
Yeah.
It suggests a real vulnerability under the surface.
That leads us to another really complex and debated aspect, his sexuality. He's seen as this icon, partly because of that perceived ambivalence or experimental approach. Did he ever address it directly?
There's that famous quote attributed to him, "No, I am not a homosexual, but I'm also not going to go through life with one hand tied behind my back."
Which is pretty revealing in itself. Open, unwilling to be boxed in.
Exactly. And the accounts from people around him really vary. Joe Hyams suggested Dean might have used sex with men strategically, to advance his career, mentioning the Rogers Brackett connection again.
Right, the kept boy comment from Bast fits that idea.
Yeah. But then others saw it differently. James Bella, a friend, thought Dean wasn't gay, but would perform an act if it benefited him. He mentioned Dean spending a summer basically as a professional house guest on Fire Island.
Opportunistic maybe?
Or just exploring, as Mark Rydell put it. Rydell just said Dean had very big appetites, and I think he exercised them. Pretty broad.
But there are more direct claims, too, from Bast and John Gilmore.
Right. Bast, as we said, confirmed a relationship. And John Gilmore claimed he and Dean experimented together, calling it bad boys playing bad boys while opening up the bisexual sides of ourselves. Gilmore later came to believe Dean was actually more gay than bisexual.
So very different interpretations, even from people who knew him. What did Nicholas Ray, his Rebel director, say?
Ray was quite direct. He said, James Dean was not straight. He was not gay. He was bisexual. Jimmy himself said more than once that he swung both ways. Seems pretty clear from Ray's perspective.
But not everyone agreed. Martin Landau?
No. Landau, who was a close friend, pushed back against the idea he was gay. He said, when Jimmy and I were together, we'd talk about girls. That was what we aspired to.
So another perspective entirely.
And then there's Elizabeth Taylor. She famously called him gay at a Gillade Awards event.
Right, I remember that.
But she later kind of nuanced it in an interview. Said something like, he hadn't made up his mind, but he was certainly fascinated by women. He flirted around. He and I twinkled.
Twinkled. That's quite a word.
And it really highlights the complexity, the ambiguity, and the way this is still debated shows how much our own views on identity shape how we see figures from the past. It wasn't just about Dean, it reflected the times and still reflects ours.
Absolutely. Okay, let's turn now to the end of his life, which is so tragically linked to his other passion, auto racing. He got into that after East of Eden.
Yeah, in 1954. And he wasn't just dabbling, he dove right in.
Got some success too, right?
Did. Won his first professional race in the novice class at Palm Springs in March '55, came second in the main event, then won his class in Bakersfield a month later. He was serious about it, even talked about racing in the Indy 500.
Wow. But the studio wasn't happy?
No, Warner Brothers barred him from racing while he was making Giant. That must have been incredibly frustrating for him given his passion for it.
You can imagine. So Giant wraps.
And he's itching to get back to racing. He trades in his Porsche Speedster for a much more powerful Porsche 550 Spyder, the infamous Little Bastard.
Chilling nickname in hindsight.
Isn't it? So September 30, 1955, he's heading to a race in Salinas. He's got his mechanic, Rolf Futherich, with him. They'd actually been ticketed for speeding earlier that day.
Oh, really? A bad sign.
A very bad sign. They're driving near Colham, California on Route 466.
And then the crash.
A college student, Donald Turnipseed, driving a Ford Tudor, made a left turn right into Dean's path. Dean's Porsche slammed into the Ford. He was trapped inside, suffered massive injuries, broken neck, among others. Futherich was thrown clear and survived. But Dean, he was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. 6:20 p.m., he was just 24 years old.
Just 24. It's hard to comprehend. And the news spread fast.
Instantly. Radio, TV. It was huge news worldwide. His funeral back in Fairmount, Indiana.
Yeah.
The coffin had to be closed because the injuries were so severe. They said 600 people were inside the church, maybe 2,400 fans outside. Just a massive outpouring of grief. And the official inquest.
Put the blame entirely on Dean for speeding. There's a monument near the crash site now, funded by a Japanese businessman, which says something about his global reach.
It really does. Even in death, the fascination continued.
And that brings us to his legacy, which is just immense, especially considering the short career. Let's start with cinema. Walk of Fame star, AFI ranking him among the greatest.
Right. And all 3 of his major films are in the National Film Registry now. That speaks volumes about their cultural importance. And for teenagers in the 50s, especially his role as Jim Stark in Rebel, it just hit a nerve. That feeling of being misunderstood, alienated.
It really resonated. Humphrey Bogart had that famous quote, didn't he? Dean died at just the right time, implying his death cemented the legend.
Yeah, he left behind a legend. If he had lived, he'd never have been able to live up to his publicity. It's a harsh thing to say, but there's maybe a kernel of truth.
How so?
Well, dying young, at the peak of that initial fame, kind of froze him in time as that symbol of rebellion and youth. He never had age on screen, never had career slumps. The myth was preserved in a tragic way.
Makes sense. Joe Hyams also talked about his broad appeal, right? Sexy to both men and women. Attributed it to that championing of youth and maybe that air of androgyny.
Exactly, and his presence lingers. You see references in other films, plays like Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean.
And that lost TV episode with Reagan turning up.
Yeah, incredible find. Even financially, his estate still earns millions each year. Though, remember that plan to use his CGI likeness in a film?
Oh yeah, that caused quite a stir. Got shut down pretty quick.
Showed their limits, thankfully. But his influence on actors, that's huge. Martin Sheen said Dean transformed acting into human behavior.
Why do you think he hit actors so hard?
It was that raw honesty, that vulnerability he brought. You hear actors like Depp, Cage, De Niro, Leo DiCaprio. They all point to Dean. DiCaprio said his performance in East of Eden just broke my heart. He showed them a new way to be truthful on screen.
It's interesting, too, that parallel with Salman Shah in Bangladesh. Similar story, dying young, huge impact. Shows how that archetype resonates globally.
It really does. And his influence wasn't just film, it was wider youth culture, especially music. David Shumway called him the first notable figure of youthful rebellion.
Right, a harbinger of youth identity politics. And the Elvis connection is undeniable. Music Connection magazine even called Dean the first rock star.
Which is funny because Rebel didn't actually have rock music in it. But the attitude, the sensibility, that absolutely fueled rock and roll.
And Dean himself had wide musical tastes, didn't he? Not just rebellion.
Oh yeah, everything from African tribal music to Stravinsky, Bartok, Sinatra too. He clearly had a deep appreciation for art in many forms.
Joel Dinerstein talked about the eroticization of the Whittle archetype, with Dean and Brando paving the way for Elvis. And Elvis's quote about Dean is amazing.
We're sullen, we're brooding. You can't be sexy if you smile. You can't be a rebel if you grin. He totally got it.
They became these symbols, Dean and Presley, for that whole generation pushing back against their parents' values. They set the template for rock and roll style.
Absolutely. The look, the attitude.
Yes.
It influenced everyone from Buddy Holly to Bob Dylan. You can see Dean in Dylan's early album covers, even David Bowie. And the song references just keep coming. Beach Boys, Eagles, Lana Del Rey, Taylor Swift.
He just keeps popping up. And finally, fashion. That look is timeless.
Completely. Jeans, white t-shirt, leather, or windbreaker jacket. It's a uniform now. Time magazine icon, Montblanc pens, Harper's Bazaar's hottest man. That simple look became the definition of cool.
You know, when you lay it all out, it's just staggering. How someone with such a brief time in the spotlight could cast such a long, varied shadow. Actor, rebel, icon, deeply complicated person.
It really wasn't just the roles, was it? It was the whole package. That raw, vulnerable, defiant spirit. It connected with a generation finding its voice, and somehow it keeps connecting. He really did lay the groundwork for so much of modern youth culture.
So thinking about all this, decades later, here's something to chew on. Why? Why does James Dean, nearly 70 years after his death, still resonate so deeply? Across generations, cultures, embodying this restless spirit that seems to transcend time, transcend film itself. What does that enduring legacy tell us about youth, about rebellion, about the sheer power an image can hold? Leaves you with a lot to think about.